Welcome to the Berkeley Research Group ThinkSet podcast. I'm your host, Eddie Newland. Berkeley Research Group is a leading global strategic advisory and expert consulting firm, providing independent advice and dispute consulting around the world to corporations, law firms, government agencies, and financial institutions. For more, please visit thinkbrg.com. On today's episode of the ThinkSet podcast, we speak with BRG Managing Director Robert Hichens and BRG Senior Associate Amy Lewis. Robert has more than 25 years of experience in corporate IT and information governance related consulting, with a focus on strategic utilization of technology and the improvement of employee engagement and motivation through culture campaigns and programs. Amy is a member of BRG's Information Governance and Technology Practice. She helps corporate legal and IT teams develop comprehensive data privacy and security initiatives to mitigate information-related risk. Today, we'll speak with both of them about the importance of security culture and best practices in building a human firewall. And with that, let's get started. Rob, Amy, thank you so much for joining us on the ThinkSet podcast today. How are you?
Hey, we're doing great.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. So given it's something that I've heard you both talk about a lot, how would you go about defining what security and privacy culture really is?
Well, I tell you, Eddie, for me, quite simply, it really defines the beliefs, the behaviors, the actions of an organization relative to data security, data privacy, and even more broadly, really the overall compliance culture of the organization, right? So is the organization really trying to do the right thing, or is it really just trying to check the box that it's meeting its compliance and privacy and security related obligations?
And from my perspective, I think everyone has the right to a degree of privacy in their lives and also to have some say in how decisions are made about them. And today, more and more of those decisions are being made based on data. So issues of privacy and especially data privacy are just becoming more important to our lives. So a privacy and security culture, in my view, is one where these kinds of issues are considered anytime we use sensitive information. You know, is this an appropriate use of the information? Are we treating it in a way that reflects its sensitivity? And all this is just in an effort to protect the sensitive information the organization has, whether it's personal data, IP, trade secrets, or anything else that needs to be protected.
So as you mentioned, Amy, there's lots of different data to protect, and that sort of speaks to why an actual culture and not just an idea. I know a lot of people talk about security, this and that, and their technology solutions, but I think what you're talking about goes a lot deeper than that, right? Why the culture itself is actually so important right now.
Right. You need to enlist the help of your workforce to implement these processes correctly. Any new rules, you need to make sure they're actually followed, and people are actually using any systems that you put in place to protect this information. So our goal with these cultures is to remove the feeling that these security and privacy practices are a requirement or they're a hurdle to overcome, they're getting in the way of you doing your work, and instead ingrain it into the everyday practices so that it becomes second nature. We're doing the right thing here with regard to this sensitive information. And then it just becomes the way that we do things around here.
I tell you, that's absolutely right, Amy. And for me, Eddie, in addition to what Amy pointed out, the stakes are just higher now, right? We all see the headlines in the news. And the reality is that the cost of a data breach or a non-compliance to a new data privacy law, like the new GDPR that's going to be rolled out for the European Union, it's just really resulting in a material impact to the organization's financial statements, let alone the price of having the organization's most sensitive data lost or stolen. But these are multi-million-dollar hits to the company's financials to either recover from a data breach or pay the fines associated with some sort of data privacy misstep. With that in mind, and really beyond all the tools and technologies that are put in place by the cybersecurity teams out there, for us, the culture is not only the missing piece, but it's really the differentiating piece that an organization can take advantage of there. Maybe even more importantly, if you think of it in the image of almost like a human firewall, right, as the employees really have the ability to provide the first line of defense in these battles. And we think that the organizations aren't taking advantage of the biggest resource in the organization, and that's its employees. And that's where we really think that there's a differentiating factor out there.
Well, you mentioned the human firewall, and Amy actually gave an example just before that, Rob, where she was talking about people don't want to adapt certain policies because it may make doing their job harder. But it's your viewpoint that you can build this wall better and higher and more secure if you can convince them that it's actually for their benefit. Can you give an example of what you do when you go in, you're working with a client, how you actually turn that person's opinion from one to the other to actually get them to buy in?
It's a great question, and there's so many ways to do that. And I think about a podcast, a leadership podcast, actually recently by Andy Stanley. For those of you out there that listen to the Andy Stanley leadership podcast, he has this whole notion of being uniquely better. And the concept is you can't just do things the way you've always have done them, right? You need to do something different. It needs to not only be unique, but it needs to be better. And if you think of how organizations traditionally provide awareness or educate employees relative to security or privacy related policies out there, it's not very engaging, right? You're most often just sending out an email message with the latest policy attached, and we're asking our employees to certify or acknowledge or what have you that they've read and understood that they're going to follow the policy. And that's really not very, very engaging at all. So where we try to take our program is the company should take advantage of the company's imagery, the values, the beliefs, so we can really create that connection to these initiatives to the overall objective and goal of the organization, and making the employees feel like they're part of something bigger, right? Not just checking the box that we've got to take the latest annual security training out there. So for us, in building out these programs, where the centerpiece of the program may be a branded micro-learning module, or it's really stepping back from the training module and creating a logo and a tagline for the initiative, right? And supporting it with posters and infographics and employee swag and gamification, and really creating some buzz, almost like a marketing campaign around the effort.
So one of our clients is a mid-sized pharma company, and they saw a lot of potential exposure due to holding on to a lot of old or trivial data, and they wanted to reduce this unnecessary data they held. So the first thing they engaged us to help with was an email deletion campaign that they titled Scrub Days. Medical scrubs sort of played into the imagery there. And so the first task was getting the message out that this email isn't just taking up space, it's potentially opening them to exposure. So we started with some infographics, some announcement videos, rolled out to a short microlearning training module that showed you not only how to manage your email inbox, but where to put things if you needed to save them longer than what was necessary according to the new email management policy. And then we finally got every employee to set aside 2 days to scrub out their inboxes. And we built this as a competition. So they have 2 locations in the US, and we had the 2 locations compete against each other. Who could delete the most email in the 2 days allocated to this? And over the course of the 2 days, they got rid of 40% of their email, which saved, I think they said, $65,000 in direct storage costs right away. And that's not even touching what they think that they're going to avoid in costs from an e-discovery standpoint. We were talking about those risks. They think that they're going to avoid millions of dollars in e-discovery costs just from their email alone. And this year, we're going to expand the initiative to network shares and other structured and unstructured data to even improve these savings.
Do you have any similar examples that would be appropriate to share?
Well, one thing that we actually got some good feedback from that initiative while we were doing the follow-up celebration to give out the prizes and awards for everybody participating in those scrub days, the CFO of the company actually approached the head of our campaign and told her that the awareness efforts and the initiative were as effective as he had ever seen. And he thought that was in large part due to the consistency of the branding and the messaging throughout the campaign. And he actually said he wished that they marketed their own products as well as the records department had marketed this campaign.
So you two obviously do this kind of thing every day. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see?
For me, Eddie, whether it's cybersecurity or data privacy or any of the other kind of compliance programs that are out there. It's the lack of not engaging the employees beyond sending out that email, right? Or publishing that the new policy has been put out there and hoping to get their acknowledgement. It's just not enough, right? The employees are overwhelmed with so much email and so many things to do on their to-do list. One more email with the latest policy attached doesn't really cut it from my vantage point. And for me, the other big mistake is not being broad enough when they put their teams together. And it really needs to be a team to attack this type of initiative. We really need folks, not only from IT security, which makes sense, but we need the folks from legal, we need the folks from internal communications, the folks from compliance to be a part of this effort.
And another mistake we see a lot, which is tangential to the campaigns, is first, before you know who you have to target, you have to know what information you have. You have to know where it is and how it's used within your organization. And we see especially more mature companies have a lot of legacy information that it's taking up space, and it could pose a risk to the company or to individuals if it's personal data, but it doesn't really serve a useful purpose anymore. So the first step in any of these is to get your arms around what data you have so that you know what you need to do to protect it, and also who in the organization you need to engage in these culture campaigns. And that also helps you determine if you know which departments you need to enlist in this effort, and each department might have a slightly different culture. We can tailor the campaign so that it really speaks to the individuals in that group.
Makes sense. Sending something different to the engineers than the sales guys. I can imagine they would respond to two completely different stimuli. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, Amy. You gave the example of how much money was able to be saved by that example of a small pharma company. Given the difficulties in actually proving negatives, how else do you measure the effectiveness of security and privacy cultures?
Boy, Eddie, I like to jump in and take a shot at that one. And because the metrics are so important, because oftentimes early on in a potential relationship with a client, we're asked, the so what question, right? You're going to help build out the culture and improve awareness. So what? And your question around metrics is key here, right? Because they need to go back to management to be able to demonstrate that these types of programs are making a difference. And that's exactly what we're doing here. And if you think of this like any other marketing campaign, to some extent, we've got some pretty good metrics to see what sort of things work better in an organization versus other marketing efforts. So for instance, if we spend 1 month putting a lot of messaging in the company common areas on the plasma screens or on their corporate intranet sites, or different whiteboard videos, all the different techniques, marketing techniques, communication techniques we employ to reach out to the employees, we start to get some feedback and live metrics on where people are clicking, what stories and what venues and what types of mediums are they more interested in than others when we're trying to get our message out there. And then on the flip side, we can start to see, have we really changed some of the behaviors and actions that we're hoping to get out of this, right? Are we seeing fewer clicks on phishing emails from the employees? For companies that are trying to reduce badge tailgating or surfing into secure areas, do we see those numbers decreasing? On the flip side, are for the data that we're really trying to protect, our most secret and sensitive and personal data, are we seeing employees tagging those files, those records with the appropriate tags and metadata, right? Things that we can count, so where we can show month over month that more of these things are being tagged correctly, right? So it's a combination of the marketing metrics and the behavioral metrics that we try to tie this all back together to show that the program's doing what it's supposed to do.
And on the same note, what we're going to look at from a metric standpoint a lot of times isn't necessarily concrete numbers. Instead, it's looking at trends. So we want to see an increase in the reportings of phishing emails, while at the same time seeing a decrease in security vulnerabilities and actions that are security risks. And jumping back a little bit to that example of the pharma company, when we're designing something for what we call gamification, which is we take the initiative and we build game mechanics into it, we want to tie those rewards back to the metrics we want to see change. So if we are doing scrub out your email inbox, the rewards are based on how many megabytes or even gigabytes did you delete out of your inbox, both individually and as a department, as a location, how many actual email messages did you get through, percentage reductions. So we try to tie those rewards to the metrics so that, first of all, we know what we're looking for when we try to get data on how well the campaign is working. And then we also ensure that the employees who we're trying to engage are doing what we want, because that's where they will see the benefit personally and as a group.
Rob, I know you've been doing this for a little while now and have talked with others in the field who, not that long ago, remember cyber being a low-level specialty. Now that it's exploding, can you think back to a particular aha moment where you felt cyber had become a priority?
I don't know, Eddie, if there's really that single moment in time. I think Amy used the words trending. It's just, we all see it, right? A day doesn't go by where we don't see something in the news about a data breach or some sort of data privacy event happening on the front page of the newspapers. And it's almost like we're not as sensitized to it as we maybe were a few years ago, right? It's old news to see that somebody else was breached or hacked or what have you. So it's definitely on top of everybody's minds. It's not just the cyber guys tucked in a small room, in the basement of whatever. And I think where for the companies that really look at this challenge holistically and they include culture along with their technology, they realize that they have a chance to have a competitive advantage, right? Because it's a gold star for them, right, to show that they are best practice in terms of not only protecting their own data, but protecting their customer data as well.
As the public just gains more consciousness about what is being collected and how it's being used, at the same time, there's an increase in the improvements in data analytics and the advent of machine learning. That means data is increasingly shared and it's increasingly important. And with these news reports, we're seeing that a lot of times this is done without our knowledge. So the public is becoming more conscious of this area of data privacy and data security. And as that happens, companies and organizations and governments are seeing increased pressure to check their actions and make sure they're considering these risks to individuals as well as the benefits they would like to see by doing this sort of processing.
One thing I was thinking about while you all were just talking, have you found any behavior patterns between generations or age groups? Intuitively, I think there might be some delineation between groups of employees based on certain ages, or perhaps even employees at different types of companies.
That's an interesting one. My initial reaction to your question is that it's the same kind of generationally across the different age groups, only because these topics are, again, in the news daily, right? Everybody's getting it and realizing this is a challenge. And in areas where you think the millennials might be more attracted to participating in these campaigns, like in the gamification aspects, than maybe a 30-year seasoned employee, it's really kind of surprising. And the research and the books will show that too. In terms of kind of gamification, just in general, there's no boundaries in terms of the limits of who's engaged in games. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing across these culture programs with the various clients that we're working with, right? Because first, we're trying to appeal to, this is something important for the company, right? It's almost kind of like that nationalistic pride, right? That's a big thing right now for countries. And I think we're seeing that even at the corporate level, where if we can appeal to the needs and the significance of these efforts to the good of the company, which ultimately is for the good of the employee, I don't think age plays a difference in that.
I think from my perspective, I don't know if I see any specific patterns that preconceived notions might say that millennials are either more tech savvy, or on the other hand, millennials are more likely to just give away their data without thinking about it. The way that we tend to see that is different groups may respond a little bit differently to different approaches to how we try to ingrain this into the culture, which is why we go about the tactic of getting things out in multiple avenues. We do infographics, we do posters, we do plasma screens, we do video, we do static, we do audio clips, we do interactive trainings, and we also do more static trainings. We give you a quick reference guide at the end, because everybody learns differently. And we want to get the information out in a way that is comfortable for the end user or the employee, rather than comfortable for the program director, which is how they would prefer to get the information. Nobody learns exactly the same way. So that's really helped us broaden our approach just to make sure that we hit all of the demographics, we hit everybody's preference so that everyone really can feel engaged in a way that's comfortable for them.
And that makes total sense. Well, Amy, Rob, thank you guys again so much for joining us here today on the ThinkSet podcast. We'll look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thanks, Eddie. This was great.
Great. Thank you, Eddie.
This ThinkSet podcast is brought to you by the Berkeley Research Group. You can subscribe to the podcast and access other content from ThinkSet Magazine by going to thinksetmag.com. I'm Eddie Newland, and thanks for listening. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, position, or policy of Berkeley Research Group or its other employees and affiliates.